I stepped into Heather's house, my hands clutching the blueberry pie I had baked that afternoon, hoping it might soften the edges of what I anticipated would be a tense evening. The place smelled of over-polished wood and something floral that stung in my sinuses, a stark contrast to the familiar warmth of my own kitchen. I smiled politely, greeted Logan and Peter, and then Heather's eyes locked on mine with that familiar cold glare. "Shut up, you widow," she snapped, her voice cutting through the small chatter like a knife. I froze for a fraction of a second, the words hitting harder than I expected. All the years, all the evenings I had stayed up late, managing bills, decorating for holidays, and keeping the family afloat, they were reduced to that single dismissive label. Just the widow. My chest tightened. I could feel the humiliation settle like a heavy coat around my shoulders. Logan chuckled nervously. Peter shifted in his seat, but no one else intervened. I thought about Henry, about how we had built everything from scratch, and about all the late nights and sacrifices no one seemed to remember. I set the pie down gently on the counter untouched, and slowly rose from my chair. They were laughing at me, thinking I would plead, argue, or cry. I gave them nothing. I walked toward the door, each step measured deliberate feeling, a strange mixture of rage and clarity. The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time that evening, I felt the weight lift slightly, as if leaving were the first act of reclaiming myself. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, carrying away the sting of their words. I walked to my car, hands still trembling, and realized that what had just happened was not the end, it was the beginning of something far bigger. The drive home was eerily silent, the hum of the engine filling the space where conversation should have been. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary, my mind replaying Heather's words over and over. Just the widow. The phrase echoed in my head like a drumbeat, relentless and heavy. I felt the anger rise, first, hot and sharp, followed closely by a familiar ache of grief. Henry's absence was palpable tonight, more than it had been in months, as if his quiet presence had always been my anchor during moments like this. I thought about the years we had spent building this family, the sacrifices made quietly unnoticed, while the children grew up accustomed to comfort and entitlement. Every late night, every skipped vacation, every extra shift, was it all erased with a single insult? My chest tightened as the memories pressed in, but beneath the sting of betrayal, a slow, simmering resolve began to take hold. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a faint trace of reassurance, a whisper from the past. Henry had been a man who planned for contingencies, who thought ahead. I remembered small hints he had dropped in, passing the subtle suggestions that I keep copies of important documents, that we update the accounts, that I always had a hand in decisions. He had always been methodical, careful, and perhaps he had anticipated my family's sense of entitlement long before I did. Even so, the fear lingered, the fear of confrontation, of the unknown, of the chaos that might unfold once I acted. But it was tempered by clarity, by the undeniable truth that I was no longer powerless. I had the experience, the knowledge, and perhaps even the guidance Henry left behind. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the anger had cooled into determination. Tonight had stripped away the illusions. Tomorrow, I would begin to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I stayed up long past midnight, the house quiet except for the soft tick of the kitchen clock. The familiar hum of the refrigerator felt almost deafening as I gathered myself and moved toward the cabinet we had always called the no-go drawer. It was a place Henry had insisted I never touch without his presence, a collection of passports, old wills, insurance policies, and other papers he deemed too sensitive for the boys to see. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled open the drawer. I rifled through the familiar documents, passing over birth certificates and old receipts, when a thick white envelope wedged in the back caught my eye. Henry's handwriting was unmistakable Miriam. I froze the envelope, feeling heavier than it physically was. With deliberate care, I slid it out and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, followed by a stack of neatly clipped documents. My eyes widened as I read the first words: legal declarations transferring full ownership of the house, the lake property in Massachusetts, every bank account and the family trust into my name. The documents were notarized, signed, and unmistakably binding. Shock washed over me first. My fingers shook as I held the papers. The weight of what Henry had done sinking in. Every insult at dinner, every dismissive remark suddenly felt powerless against the authority now resting squarely in my hands. A surge of empowerment followed, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The years of invisibility, of being labeled just the widow, began to crumble beneath me. I sat back in the chair, breathing slowly, realizing for the first time that I had been prepared for this moment all along. Henry had anticipated their entitlement, their arrogance, and he had given me the means to reclaim what was mine. The quiet of the night enveloped me, but the clarity of purpose burned bright. I stacked the documents, neatly resolved to act with careful precision. This was not just discovery. It was the beginning of a plan that could restore what had been denied me for too long, and perhaps teach them all a lesson they would never forget. I dialed Alan Reynolds' number and waited, listening to the familiar hum of the line. When he answered, groggy but attentive, I felt a strange mix of relief and urgency. "Alan, it's Miriam," I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through me. "I found the documents Henry left. I need to verify everything immediately." He asked a few routine questions, then confirmed the papers were authentic, notarized, and legally binding. Hearing his voice say those words sent a shiver down my spine. Every hesitation, every insult from my children, every night I had spent invisible, all of it now felt like a prelude to this moment. We discussed strategy carefully. Alan explained the steps to activate my authority over the estate, the accounts and the properties, emphasizing discretion. Any premature action or disclosure could alert Heather and the others, potentially complicating enforcement. My mind raced as I weighed each choice: act immediately and assert control, or wait and observe, letting them continue in ignorance while I gathered certainty. Even as I listened to Alan, doubt crept in. Was it ethical to withhold this from them, even temporarily? Would I appear vindictive rather than justified? I reminded myself that years of disregard and entitlement had left them unprepared for the responsibility they assumed was theirs by default. By the time the call ended, a clear plan had emerged. I would proceed with precision, maintaining control and silence, until every step was executed. The documents in my hands were more than paper. They were the key to reclaiming what was mine, and Henry had ensured I could do it with authority and clarity. I placed the papers back in the drawer, my resolve firm, knowing that tomorrow morning would mark the first act of reclaiming not just property, but the respect and recognition I had long been denied. The morning sun cut through the blinds as I sat at my kitchen table. The notarized documents spread before me like a map of everything I had worked for and everything Henry had protected. I signed the final forms confirming the transfer of the house, the lake property, every account, and the trust into my name. The papers were more than legal instruments. They were proof that I was no longer invisible, no longer sidelined, no longer just the widow. Once Alan Reynolds confirmed that everything was active and binding, I felt the calm clarity of authority settle over me. I dressed carefully, as if preparing for a ceremony, and carried the folder with me. I wasn't rushing or acting out of anger. I was precise, deliberate, and fully in control. I arrived at Heather's house mid-morning, the air crisp and the street quiet. Heather was arranging the table for brunch. Logan was pacing, and Peter pretended to check his phone. I walked in without hesitation, placing the folder on the counter. "I need to inform you all that the estate plan has been executed," I said evenly. "Everything is legally under my name. Every account, every property, every trust." A stunned silence filled the room. Heather's hand froze in the air, her fork hovering above the plate. Logan's eyes widened, and Peter's face drained of color. They looked at each other, searching for reassurance, but there was none. I observed them quietly, each reaction playing out like a carefully scripted scene of disbelief and panic. Heather finally spoke, her voice shaky but sharp. "You can't do this? There must be some mistake." I shook my head, keeping my voice calm. "There is no mistake. Henry made the arrangements months before his passing. Every document is notarized, verified, and active." The words sank in slowly. I let them process the reality without interruption, allowing the shock to settle, to ripple through them fully. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about recognition and rightful authority. I stepped back, folding my hands over the folder, watching their panic quietly unfold, knowing that today marked the beginning of consequences they had never expected. I stayed home that morning, quietly monitoring the ripple of confusion I had set in motion. Notifications from the banks and estate managers arrived in a steady stream, confirming what I already knew. Heather and the boys could not access a single account. The lake property was locked under my name, and every trust fund transfer required my authorization alone. The chaos was methodical, almost poetic in its precision. Ava appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and cautious. "Grandma, are they really locked out?" she asked softly. I nodded. She flinched at the idea, but then looked at me, seeking reassurance rather than judgment. Her innocence and empathy stood in stark contrast to her parents' entitlement and greed. I reached out, ruffling her hair lightly, and told her it would all be all right, that some lessons had to be learned the hard way. I didn't call Heather, or the boys didn't threaten, didn't speak a word beyond that moment. Watching their struggle unfold without interference was enough. The irony settled in. Quietly, years of being dismissed, ignored, and labeled just the widow had led to this exact moment, and I had no need to raise my voice to prove it. The satisfaction was tempered by clarity. This wasn't revenge, it was recognition of authority, justice, executed cleanly and legally, and a demonstration that entitlement and arrogance carry consequences when confronted with preparation and foresight. I allowed myself a small smile, the quiet power of knowing that I had been ready for this all along. I turned back to the documents spread across the table, feeling the weight of responsibility and the edges of strategy sharpening in my mind. The first waves of consequence were only the beginning, and the next steps required careful attention. By mid-afternoon, I had spent hours reviewing account statements, transaction histories, and property transfers. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Logan and Heather had been making unauthorized withdrawals, diverting funds into personal accounts, and attempting to manipulate investments in ways Henry would never have approved. Each line item, each altered record, was a testament to their arrogance and sense of entitlement. I gathered the notarized documents, the bank confirmations, and the flagged transaction reports, and headed to Heather's house. My steps were deliberate, my hands steady the folder, a weight of authority rather than threat. When I arrived, Heather and the boys were busy arranging the table for what they assumed would be a normal brunch. I placed the folder on the counter and met their eyes calmly. "This is everything you've been hiding," I said evenly. "Unauthorized transfers, attempted diversions of family assets, and actions outside your authority. Every transaction is documented, notarized, and verified." Heather's mouth opened, then closed. Logan and Peter exchanged nervous glances. They expected excuses, denials, or even some display of weakness from me. They did not expect the evidence laid bare, presented without anger, without theatrics, just the facts. Heather tried to interrupt, her voice sharp, her tone attempting control. This is ridiculous. Some of this must be a mistake. I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. No mistakes. Every document here confirms exactly what you did, and what you thought was safe for your use is legally irrelevant now. The room went silent. Logan's jaw tightened. Peter's face paled. Heather's bravado faltered as the reality sank in. Their sense of entitlement, their confidence that the estate would bend to their whims, evaporated instantly. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of empowerment that was steady and unshakable. This was not about revenge. It was about authority, accountability, and the recognition of years of oversight and preparation. They could no longer hide behind arrogance or manipulation. I allowed them a moment to absorb it fully before gathering the folder and stepping back. The next phase would require precision, but now the truth was out, and their panic was only beginning to settle in. Once the immediate shock had settled, I turned my attention to the task that truly mattered, ensuring the estate reflected not only Henry's foresight, but also the values I wanted to preserve. I went through every account, property, and trust, carefully reallocating where necessary. The smaller house outside town with the porch swing, Henry always said, reminded him of his grandmother, was transferred into Ava's name. She had never asked, but she had always shown respect, empathy, and integrity, the qualities I wanted to honor. I reviewed investments and liquidated redundant or mismanaged funds, ensuring that nothing remained tied to Heather or Logan in a way that could compromise the estate or the lessons Henry had embedded within it. Every signature, every transaction was deliberate, precise, and fully within my authority. I felt the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming control without resorting to vindictive measures. My goal was stability and justice, not humiliation. By midday, I drafted the framework for a small fund in Henry's name, a grant program designed to support widows in our region who had been overlooked, dismissed, or left vulnerable after their spouses passed. I envisioned it helping women regain independence and confidence much as I had regained mine. Setting it up was a process, but the purpose was clear, and each step reinforced a sense of purpose that went beyond mere property or money. Sitting back after a call with the lawyer and the estate accountant, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The house was quiet, the papers organized, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of fear and uncertainty lift. I had navigated the chaos, maintained dignity, and created something that extended beyond myself and my family. As I looked at Ava quietly reading in the next room, I understood the full meaning of legacy. It wasn't in wealth alone, it was in the values passed forward, in protecting what mattered most, and in ensuring the next generation had the tools to thrive. Tomorrow would bring final closure with the family, but for now, I sat calmly knowing I had reclaimed not only what was mine, but what Henry had entrusted to me. Heather arrived at my door the following morning, her expression tentative, as if testing whether I would still respond to her presence. "Miriam, I know things got out of hand." She began, her voice soft, but laced with unease. I let her words hang in the air, listening without interrupting. Logan and Peter had stayed back, their faces pale and uneasy, and Peter's hesitant glance toward me betrayed more guilt than any apology could. I had already finalized all the documents with Alan Reynolds. The fraudulent transfers had been addressed, the accounts secured, and any lingering legal matters carefully closed. Authorities had been notified where necessary, but the weight of responsibility had already shifted firmly into my hands. The estate was now protected, the misuse of funds corrected, and the path for Ava's inheritance clearly defined. Heather's attempts at reconciliation faltered as I maintained a calm, measured presence. I acknowledged her words without inviting further manipulation, allowing her to confront her own actions in silence. Peter muttered a quiet, "I didn't know. I didn't realize," but there was no defense needed, only recognition of their failures and the consequences they had ignored. I reflected on the strange sense of peace settling over me. Authority had been claimed not with rage, but with measured precision. There was satisfaction, yes, but it was not born of revenge. It was the satisfaction of rightful order restored, of a plan executed fully and ethically. Ava appeared in the doorway, glancing at me with that steady, quiet gaze that had always set her apart. I smiled briefly, feeling the calm clarity of knowing the next generation would witness integrity rewarded. The house was quiet, the estate secured, and the family's reckoning complete. I closed the folder, the weight of years of frustration finally lifting, and allowed myself to consider what rebuilding truly meant as I prepared for the final step. The days that followed were quieter, but not idle. I began restoring my home, repairing the fence Henry and I had postponed for years, and tending to the garden that had long been neglected. Each task, each small improvement felt like a reclamation of control, a tangible reflection of the life I had worked so hard to preserve. I reconnected with friends I had let drift away, sharing meals and laughter that had been absent for too long. These moments reminded me that life extended beyond the confines of family obligations and entitlement. Ava continued to astonish me with her maturity. She handled the estate matters I allowed her to observe with care and thoughtfulness, her curiosity tempered by integrity. She asked questions about the fund I had established for widows in our region, genuinely interested in how it could help others, not just in understanding the mechanics of money or property. Watching her, I realized the importance of passing on values as well as assets. I settled into a rhythm that was uniquely mine. For the first time in decades, I felt the freedom to make decisions unencumbered by guilt or expectation. The empowerment I had longed for was no longer theoretical. It was real and fully in my hands. Every signed document, every carefully executed transfer, every measured step had led to this quiet authority, and it was accompanied by a sense of moral clarity that I had never experienced before. In the evenings, I would sit in the sunroom, a cup of tea in hand, watching the light shift over the property. The estate was secure, the family lessons delivered, and the next generation embodied in Ava had a model of resilience and integrity to follow. I allowed myself a small smile, thinking of Henry and the life we had built together, and the knowledge that I had honored his foresight while reclaiming my own path. I was no longer reacting to others' expectations or demands. I was living fully, making choices that reflected my values, and building a future defined by independence, dignity, and freedom. This was the life I had earned, and finally, the life I was free to embrace.